Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program titled Health Information Overload, Getting Discrete Clinical Data Out of PDF Attachments and into the EMR. My name is Rajiv Leventhal, and I'm Senior Editor for Healthcare Informatics. Today's program is sponsored by Extract Systems. Thank you to our sponsor and to you and our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping details. Each window on your screen can be moved by clicking and dragging, or enlarged and minimized by clicking the icons in the top right corner of each window. Please use the Q&A area to the right of the slides to submit a question at any time. If you cannot see this area, simply click the red Q&A button. To download a copy of today's slides, please use the links in the resources list located in the lower left of your screen. If you have any technical issues during the program, please click the yellow help button to troubleshoot the issue. You can also tweet during today's webinar via the Twitter widget by clicking on the blue Twitter icon at the bottom of your screen. Simply click the Post and Authorize buttons to log into your Twitter account and begin sharing automatically at the event hashtag HCI Live Webinar. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Becky Schroeder, MT, is from UW Health Information Services, where she is Clinical Systems Manager at Clinical Ancillaries, University of Wisconsin Health. Greg Geese is VP of Marketing at Extract Systems. Thank you, Greg and Becky, for taking the time to speak with us today. And with that, the audience is yours.
Thank you very much. As stated, my name is Becky Schroeder. I'm a lab tech by trade. I currently work for UW Health in the Information Services Department, and I'm the Clinical Systems Manager overseeing clinical ancillary systems that can be found in various departments such as the lab, radiology, cardiology, and a variety of other ologies. I first want to start by telling you a little bit about UW Health. UW Health is an integrated health system serving about over 500,000 patients each year in the upper Midwest and beyond. We have about 1,400 physicians, 16,500 employees, 6 hospitals and 80 outpatient clinics. Of our 4 hospitals that are in the Madison area, we have UW Hospital, which is our main hospital. Connected with that is American Family Children's Hospital. We also have UW Health at the American Center, which just opened this past August. And we have our UW Health Rehabilitation Hospital, which just opened yesterday. Along with that, we have 2 regional hospitals, Swedish American and Belvedere Medical Center, both in Illinois. We have our medical foundation, which is our faculty physician practice. We have an insurance company, Unity Health Insurance, and we have our university healthcare system that oversees our regional relationships. Along with that, we have joint ventures, and we also work very closely with the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. To take a step further into our Madison hospitals, we have 648 beds total. We have a variety of different kinds of admissions, outpatient visits, and ED visits, so we're kept quite busy. We have 7 ICUs with 99 beds. We do have a level 4 surgical NICU, and we have a level 1 trauma center. We are the second area in the state that has this. We have an NCI designated cancer center. We have an organ transplant program, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. We also are a magnet hospital, and we've been voted the #1 hospital in Wisconsin. For our clinics, we have 50 locations found in south central Wisconsin. We have almost 2.5 million visits annually. We have 400 primary care physicians, and we also oversee a variety of comprehensive medical and surgical subspecialties. Lastly, to take a deeper dive into who is UW Health as it relates to transplant, we do have a large transplant program where we serve citizens in Wisconsin, the United States, and the world, and we've been doing so for 40 years. We offer a wide range of transplants, and to date, we have performed more than 12,000 transplants. Now to take a deeper dive into the point of our talk today, and why it's important to capture test data in structured EMR fields. Well, as indicated, we have a large transplant program. It's very important to our transplant providers that we capture this data in discrete format. Because of the fact that we see patients from all over the world, we know that the patients aren't there on site to have their labs performed in our internal labs. More often, the patients are having that lab work performed all over the nation, and those results are being sent into our transplant department. Because of the fact that they need this discrete format, they need it for reasons such as being able to track and trend the data. It's important for them to be able to understand the patient's care and how the patient's doing over time. Our providers expect a quick turnaround time of these results, and we found that scanning documents and getting that sort of turnaround takes a little bit longer than finding a better process to be able to get the data in and sent out to the providers in basket. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but staff need a way to be able to organize the giant influx of data. So in the future, I'll talk about the fact that we're not just talking about lab results, we're talking about a variety of other sorts of results as well. And again, as I indicated, our patient population is from all over the nation, not just locally in Wisconsin. So what was UW doing prior to the automated process? Well, a lot of it was manual. The staff had to manually enter the patient test data into the EMR to be able to track the lab results on patients before and after transplant. Just to give you some numbers here, over 6 months prior to our automated process going into place, we had about 5,000 patients. Of those patients, we processed about just under 31,000 orders, but that equated to almost 325,000 component level results. So an example of this might be a CBC, where you may have one order, but that could result in at least 15 different components, thereby creating a very large volume of component level results that had to be manually hand entered into the EMR. As I indicated previously, the transplant staff had to sort through a variety of documentation that was sent to UW. It wasn't just lab work. Some other examples that came into the transplant department included other radiology results, procedural results, prescription refills, consent forms, you name it. So part of their workflow was to have to sort through all the paperwork, pull out the lab results, and then use that paper to enter into the EMR. Lastly, the IT department had to maintain a lot of system build in order to accommodate their needs. We had to be able to put in that foundational build to allow them to be able to enter the discrete lab results. This took a lot of time and energy in order to keep up with the 1,000+ labs that the transplant department was entering results for. What was the negative impact of our previous practice? Well, a big one was time. It was a large volume of data that staff were trying to keep up with. Staff were beginning to realize that they needed a different process in order to keep up with the volume. Because of a lot of the results were entered manually, there's a higher incidence of error rates. And while staff don't like to make errors, when you're manually transcribing, there's a greater chance of it. And so we wanted to try to find a way to prevent that. The transplant department needed to meet the lab requirements. Lab calls them their 13 points of light, but they were very specific as far as what types of data needed to be entered for a particular result. It was important to be able to capture the collection date and time, the performing lab, the components, the values for those components, the reference ranges, units of measure, and the result date and time. Again, with all of that and all the requirements, IT had to continuously maintain the build and keep up with change. Lastly, there was staffing. Transplant had a very busy department, and they needed to ensure that they had the appropriate staff in order to keep up with the demand. So how did we solve the problem, and what are we doing today? Well, as stated, transplant really wanted to find a more automated solution. So they started to reach out and try to find out whether there was a more automated solution out there. After they looked around a bit, they were able to find a solution that they thought felt their needs. As with any organization, money had to be budgeted, and then time had to be set aside in order to be able to implement that solution. Once the money was budgeted and approved, then the time was spent to work with the vendor and to work with IT to be able to implement the solution. First thing that was done was to work closely with the vendor and transplant in order to evaluate the workflows, understand the existing workflow, and then to be able to understand the newer solution and cater the workflow to the newer solution. We found that a lot of the transplant department had a lot of different sorts of workflows that we needed to be able to cater the product to meet those needs. And so there was a lot of discussion on how to cater the product to meet the needs of the staff. And lastly, with any sort of implementation of a new product, we had to install the system. We obviously had to test the system, train, and then lastly, we had to be able to implement the system. So what are the results, the before and after? The solution was implemented a couple of years ago, and we found that staff were able to enter in tests much more quickly and more of them per hour. So ultimately, this did result in a decreased turnaround time of results, which was very important, and also allowed for staff to be able to enter in more results over time. In the slides, a comment that one of our transplant corners had made, indicating that tests were being entered 80% faster, and improvements are still being made. The backlog was smaller, and what was very important to them was that the test results were into the EMR much more quickly, especially for high priority patients, to be able to get those results in within an hour. So, in terms of moving forward, one item I wanted to talk about with regards to transplant that isn't mentioned on this slide is the fact that some work had been done after going live where additional workflows were identified that we felt we could work with the vendor in order to achieve a gap. One of those was priority. So transplant has patients that are higher priority to them than others depending upon the criticality of the patient and how sick they are. So they needed to be able to identify those patients to be able to decrease the turnaround time in order to get the results to the provider. So development was done in order to meet that gap. Secondly, and as some of you might know, sometimes you deal with duplicate results. Transplant was dealing with a high volume of duplicate results where they would receive results and then a little bit later receive the results again. They needed to be able to address this issue. It was taking up too much time to be able to try to understand whether something was duplicate. And so they worked with the vendor to enhance the system to be able to identify those duplicate documents more easily for them. In addition to transplant, there was a decision made to be able to implement this product for another department within our organization. The department was called the Clinical Documentation Services Department, otherwise known as CDS. The workflows that CDS had been performing was manual, and they were doing it for a variety of reasons on behalf of multiple departments within the organization. As I indicated, UW Health has a variety of specialists. And so we have patients that come to our specialists for certain types of care, such as oncology, and then the patient might go back to their primary location to have their test work performed, their lab work performed. And so oncology needed somebody to be able to enter those results back into our EMR on behalf of their patients. Additionally, within family practice, we've had a variety of initiatives. Diabetes is one of them, but additional chronic disease management initiatives in which it was important to have discrete lab results entered into the EMR for specific sorts of tests. And so this department also entered results on behalf of family practice for certain sorts of initiatives, such as diabetes. Also mentioned, we have a variety of clinics that are found within a large portion of Wisconsin. And some of those areas, the relationship our clinic might have is with that regional hospital, where we don't have HL7 interfaces to allow that data to flow back into our EMR electronically. And so we needed a department to be able to enter those results for those sites as well. So we made the decision to be able to move forward with this department also using the application. We did have to create some new workflows to account for differences. So that was one big item that we had to discuss. And that was in the form of a statement of work to really outline what those workflows are and how they differed from transplant. We kicked the project off in fall of 2014, and we went live this past April in 2015. What's nice to say is within the first month, we were able to set a plan to be able to implement for other sites. And when I say that, I mean that Clinical Documentation Services was able to take on additional work for other sites in which they were also asking for discrete lab data to be entered into the EMR, and they were in the process of looking for a solution. So that was a huge benefit and continues to be a huge benefit for our organization. At the current time, we're in the process of establishing an orders interface. So right now, our workflow includes a results interface in which the data from the application flows directly into the EMR. What this means is part of the workflow today results in staff needing to go into our EMR to find the patient medical record number and the order number and paste that into the vendor application. With establishing the orders interface, we've thereby eliminated that need and rather are going to be able to send electronic orders and patient demographics into the application to allow a more streamlined approach and less copying and pasting. We are set to go live in October with this orders interface. We anticipate this turnaround, or the turnaround, to decrease with the implementation of this orders interface. And this also aligns with other organizational initiatives. One large initiative that we needed to address and did address this past spring was finding a standard approach for ordering procedures, lab tests, within our institution when we know the patient's going elsewhere for that procedural work. We're able to go live with that initiative this past May, and now we're able to build upon that in order to more easily identify orders that we want to be able to send in to our vendor application. Lastly, in terms of lessons learned, we've learned that the implementation of any technology is not just about the technology, but it's the work invested to be able to re-engineer the workflow that surrounds the system. The workflow we've found can be just as important as the technology itself. We also learned that the aptitude for one workflow can be very different than the aptitude for another. We went from asking staff to take a physical sheet of paper and manually transcribe into a templated screen within our EMR to now looking at an electronic document and flipping through that document to compare that the data had been parsed off that document correctly. For some staff, we learned that this was an easy change to be able to move into. Others, it was a bit more of a struggle. So another lesson learned tied into that is that the people we put in place are key to success and to ensure that the product is successful. Lastly, it was important for us to be able to communicate the fact that the technology can make the process better, and indeed it has made the process better. But human intervention is still needed. We still need people to be able to look at what has been parsed off the document. We still need people to verify what they're looking at. So it was important for us to communicate this, to know that while workflows will improve, while you'll have decreased turnaround, while you'll be able to process more information, you still need a person to verify what you're looking at, and that we won't ever be able to make it 100% and completely eliminate the human factor. This now concludes my portion of the presentation, and I will now be passing it off to Greg. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you for taking the time to share your experience with all of us today. I found what you had to say to be very interesting. I was particularly pleased to hear you talk about how, in addition to the technology, you really also need to focus both on the workflows surrounding the use of that technology, but also ensuring that you have the appropriate skill sets in place to take advantage of that technology. I think oftentimes, for whatever reason, organizations that we work with tend to be very, very focused on the technology itself. And while that's part of the solution, really the complete solution is to look at all the pieces where that technology touches, how that technology might change your workflows, and how it might actually change the work for the people who are doing the work. But then lastly, that your last point about human intervention is still required, and that's something I'll talk a little bit about in my presentation. But I do think that's important to understand, is that that technology isn't the cure-all. It certainly is a tool, and it certainly can make things much improved. But having those other pieces in place is critically important. So thank you for that. So just before I jump into my presentation, I'll give myself a real quick introduction. In case anyone has forgotten who I am. My name is Greg Geese. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for Extract Systems. So I'd like to build a little bit upon Becky's presentation and talking about really the reasons why it's important to capture discrete clinical data from unstructured documents or data sets and getting that data into the EMR. As our title suggests, often this really involves PDF documents that may already be attached to patient records in the EMR, but it can involve other types of documents as well. One thing that I want to point out is that UW was a bit unique in terms of the way that they were already working. They were initially inspired really to solve the problem, or to solve, I guess, really to improve their data entry workflow or their data capture workflow. Many of the organizations that we work with haven't actually taken that step to manually enter that data into EMR, because it is such a time-intensive and very expensive endeavor. However, in the UW transplant department, they'd already taken that step. They'd seen the value. They understood the value of having that data in a discrete format in structured fields in the EMR for various reasons, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that's a bit different than what we normally see. And so while they were initially focused on improving the data entry process, that is, to improve data quality, to speed up the data capture process, to be able to do it at a lower cost or do it more productively. So the question is, if you're not doing data entry today, that is entering discrete clinical data from these unstructured documents into EMR data fields, structured EMR data fields, are there other reasons that what are the reasons actually to capture this information into the discrete fields? And I imagine many of the people on the presentation today who joined us probably have a pretty good understanding of that, but that's really what I'm going to be focusing on during this presentation. And so really putting into place an automated data capture process or workflow isn't just for hospitals that are already doing manual data entry. I just want to make that point very clear. In fact, we find that the benefits by automating the data capture process, it's greater for hospitals that aren't already doing manual data entry. And that's simply because they're not already benefiting from having this information in structured form in their EMR. They're still dealing with a lot of PDF attachments in patient records. So as you'll see in this presentation, unstructured data impacts hospitals in several ways that can not only impact the cost of care, but can also have an impact on the quality of care. So if you're like, the other hospitals, some of the other hospitals that we've worked with, you can probably relate to this situation, right? We've already taken several measures in order to streamline information exchange between care providers, between hospitals, and you've been making investments in these technologies. You've probably implemented an EMR or EHR. You've increased your investment in lab interfaces. You've taken steps, most likely, or are in the process of taking steps to meet meaningful use criteria if you participated in the government incentive program to implement an electronic health record system. But despite all that, you continue to receive, important health information. You continue to receive this either by fax, they come in, paper documents being brought in by the patients. They might be coming in PDF attachments coming through an information exchange or being downloaded from a portal, or you might be getting e-faxes. And let's not forget that, for the past many years, you've probably been scanning and attaching PDF files into the into patient records, so you have all of those documents in there as well. So the problem, unfortunately, hasn't gone away. It's probably improved. You're probably getting more information electronically than you have in the past, but the problem still exists. Well, if there's a silver lining in any of this, it's that you're not alone. I apologize, this graph's a little hard to see, but this is a recent graph that came out of a ONC data brief just very recently, this past August. Really what the headline says is that less than 10% of hospitals use only an electronic means of exchange of patient information. And as indicated by the darker blue bar there in the middle, the good news is that very few hospitals or organizations continue to remain on a paper-only system, and that the vast majority of hospitals are somewhere in between. They have a mix of paper and electronic, and so that's good news. The industry is certainly moving in the right direction. But I did want to call out sort of the fine print at the bottom of that graph. The graph alone doesn't necessarily tell the full story, and I think it's important to really sort of pay attention to the details or to read the fine print. And what that fine print says is that electronic methods include secure messaging using an EHR, which that basically means information that's being transferred between EHRs in an interoperable format. It includes provider portals or via health information exchange organizations or other third parties. And so really the way to interpret that statement is that while this information may be coming across electronically, it doesn't necessarily mean that that information is in fact interoperable with the system that you have implemented at your hospital. And this is for a variety of reasons that I won't go into. But I think that's a really important point to point out, that simply going electronic doesn't necessarily solve this problem of having to deal with unstructured data. So as we're going through this presentation, just sort of think about that. Simply being electronic really doesn't solve the problem entirely. It solves part of the problem, and certainly there's value in being, in having an electronic information flow. But that alone really isn't sufficient to overcome the challenges of dealing with unstructured clinical data. And so the result really of exchanging all of this unstructured information, which you've been doing for the past several years, prior to implementing an EHR and prior to doing everything that you're doing in order to achieve meaningful use, and trying to interface with as many laboratories or outside providers as you can, is that the EMR really, in many cases, has simply become an electronic file folder. And so really, unfortunately, what you're probably finding is that you've exchanged one difficult to work with medium, that is paper, with another difficult to work with medium, that is PDF documents, is most commonly the format document, but it could include scanned documents in TIFF format. It could include other types of documents. And really the key thing here is that while going electronic is a step in the right direction, that the information is now stored electronically, it doesn't go far enough really to make that information as useful as it needs to be in order to improve the quality as well as lower the cost of care. And so really, one of the points that I want to make is that, paper isn't the problem entirely. Really the problem is unstructured data. That's the primary problem. And I realized, I've been talking throughout this presentation about unstructured data, and I imagine many of you, if not all of you, who are, listening in or watching the webinar today, probably has a good understanding of what unstructured data is. But just in case there are a few of you out there who aren't familiar with it, I just want to make sure that we're all sort of thinking about this in the same way. So I'll talk a little bit about what is unstructured data and why is it bad. Wikipedia defines it as information that either does not have a predefined data model or is not organized in a predefined manner. And it's bad because it really makes that information difficult to work with. Information in a structured database can be queried. It can be, used for reporting purposes. It can easily be searched and found. Whereas unstructured data can be difficult to search through, takes longer to do that, it's harder to analyze that information, if not really impossible to analyze information that remains in a structured format. And additionally, it increases the cost of work and the time that it takes to do that work that depends on that information. And as Becky mentioned in her presentation, it can also increase the risk of errors. In their case, she was talking about data entry errors, but other types of errors can occur as a result of difficult to access information or information that might be difficult to interpret. And then lastly, I imagine many of you have probably experienced this. Physicians get really frustrated when they have to spend a lot of time searching through the EMR for the information that they need in order to do their jobs in the most effective way possible. So if they're unhappy, really everyone's going to be unhappy, and it's going to impact, it's going to impact the quality of care. So Becky described earlier that there are costs. There are both, direct financial or tangible costs, and she talked about some of those in her presentation. There are also indirect and qualitative or perhaps intangible costs, if you want to think of it that way, to managing this unstructured information or unstructured data. In addition to the cost that Becky described, we've heard other complaints in our work about how unstructured data in both paper as well as PDF document formats or other document formats impacts them and their organization. And perhaps one of the greatest concerns we hear is really that time that it takes physicians to find that information that they need. So to think about this a little bit, you can sort of think about this in, to put a number on it, think about this in terms of, a dollar value. Think about the value of a physician's time. Think about how much they're paid. And so, put a little example here on the slide is that, think about an office that has, a total of 10 doctors who each see an average of 15 patients per day. If they have to take one additional minute per patient encounter to search through documents to find the information that they need in order to be properly informed when they're meeting with that patient, the cost of that time in total for those 10 physicians over the span of a year is $70,000. And that's a lot of money, and that's just 1 minute or really 15 minutes per day per physician. The reality is that it takes much more time than simply 1 minute to find that information in many cases. And also in many offices, physicians are seeing, nearly twice, 20, 25, maybe up to 30 patients in a day. So if you use those numbers, you come out with a much bigger number. So the actual cost can actually be several times that amount. And the reasons for that is, physicians often access these documents more than once. Plus the time it takes to find that information takes significantly longer than a minute. So, they not only have to scroll through a list of documents. If you refer back to that screenshot I showed you earlier, the long list of documents there, that was actually one of the better screenshots that I've seen where the documents each had very descriptive names, which would indicate to the physician what that document is. It also had a date. It was all very helpful information. Fortunately, I've seen other situations where physicians aren't presented with that level of detail about a file and its contents. They simply see a system-generated file name and have to really guess based on the date of that document as to whether it's the document that they're looking for. So oftentimes they're having to open up multiple documents to find the one that they're looking for, and then they got to sift through that document to find the information that they're actually looking for. But the direct costs aren't only a problem, with physicians. It also impacts nurses who are managing the document workflows, and Becky talked a little bit about that in her presentation, to ensure that this information is made available to providers in a timely manner. This could be things as simple as, making copies of these documents, or hand delivering these documents, or dropping these documents in interoffice mail, filing these documents, all the things that they need to do in order to make that information accessible to those people who need it and when they need it. And using that same office that I've used in the previous example, let's say that office has 20 full-time nurses on staff, and in total, 10% of their time is spent managing these documents. Well, 10% of 20 nurses' time, that amounts to nearly $250,000 per year being spent on document management tasks. Lastly, and this is really most relevant to organizations like UW that had already taken that step to do manual data entry of clinical data into the EMR fields. Just thinking about the cost of those folks who are doing that data entry. Fully loaded cost for a full-time staff member who is trained to enter this data, can be as high as $50,000 per year, fully loaded. That's, all benefits and everything that the hospital has to pay for that. So using a conservative estimates that I've used here, the value of the problem for a fairly modest-sized office is nearly, $400,000 per year, and we haven't even started talking about the costs that are indirectly affecting, hospitals and care providers. So the challenge isn't simply, converting documents from a paper form into electronic form, as I mentioned before. The challenge is how do you get the actionable clinical data out of unstructured documents and into the discrete structured EMR fields. And furthermore, doing it quickly to avoid disruption to patient care, doing it accurately to ensure patient safety, and lastly, to be able to do it cost effectively. Manual data entry makes sense for some, but most, as we've seen, simply can't or haven't been able to justify it up until this point. But hopefully, as you'll see, that as you've seen, that you'll begin to understand that actually getting that information out of those documents and into the appropriate fields in the EMR can solve a lot of problems for a healthcare organization. And it's not simply about doing data entry faster, but it's actually about getting that data out of those documents and into the EMR in the first place. And then secondly, how do you do that in the most efficient and cost-effective way? So what are the possible solutions for capturing discrete clinical data into the EHR? When you evaluate your different options, you really have, 4 main requirements or criteria that you'll probably use to weigh your options. One is, will the capture methodology make the information available in the EMR in a manner that is, timely? For example, can it be done as quickly as, say, sending a photocopy of a report to the physician who ordered it, whether that's being sent via interoffice mail or by hand delivery? Another, criterion you might use is it able to capture the information accurately so that we can be assured patients won't be accidentally harmed by putting the wrong information into the system? You'll also think in terms of whether this methodology that you put into place is cost-effective, meaning do the benefits sufficiently outweigh the cost that an investment in this area is as good or better than the alternative investments that you could be making with your IT dollars? And then lastly, you should also consider, can this methodology be used elsewhere? Can you further leverage this investment, or is it only for a specific type of workload? For example, in the case that Becky mentioned at UW, they started out in transplant because they had a very high volume of test results and other types of reports that we're receiving from the outside. But now they've started to leverage that technology and deploy it elsewhere within their organization. So using those criteria, if we look at manual data entry as one of your options, it's a very time-consuming task. And as a result, often data entry is one of the last steps that happens after doctors review the documents, right? Because it takes so long to enter the data, you don't want to hold up that information going to the physician before that data is entered. So often that information gets relayed to the physician prior to it actually getting entered. So it's effectively being entered as a record as opposed to as a way of communicating that information to the physician in the first place. And so that really doesn't solve the problem that I've talked about earlier, in that physicians are having to continue to search for that information, at least initially before that information gets into the system. There's a very high cost of labor with manual data entry. Each piece of data is probably touched either by two people or touched by one person twice. And that is, they not only have to enter that data, but they also need to validate that the data entry was accurate. And that's because data error rates in healthcare can have very serious consequences. And Becky mentioned this in her presentation, data error rates for manual data entry can be quite high. If you think about the kind of data that's being entered from these documents, the complexity of data, the complexity of the documents, it's often being done in a highly distracted environment where people are multitasking, trying to do other things. It can in fact lead to very high error rates. In terms of being able to leverage manual data entry in other areas, really, it's very, extendable, meaning you can enter whatever data you want manually, so long as you have people who are sufficiently trained in that particular type of data and how to read the documents and capture the data appropriately. When you take a look at things like interfaces, so think about reference labs and interfaces to those, or connections to health information exchanges, you'll conclude that they deliver incredible speed. Nothing will get that information into your organization faster than having a direct connection into your EMR. The question is whether that information is flowing into your EMR in a structured format, or is it continuing to flow in unstructured format. In some cases, you'll find that even though you're going through a health information exchange, a lot of unstructured data can still pass through as PDF documents that simply get attached to a patient record. And the cost of these interfaces can be quite high. We've heard prices as high as $50,000 per lab, in addition to the ongoing maintenance costs. Lastly, interfaces also ensure a very high accuracy, which is one of the great things about interfaces, right? So whatever is reported by the reporting facility, whether it's a laboratory or some other provider, whatever they've sent is most likely what you're going to receive. So the only chance for error there would be that they sent you erroneous data in the first place. But certainly in the data capture process, there's unlikely to be any errors introduced. However, when it comes to flexibility, interfaces can really be a challenge. In the case of lab interfaces, they're point-to-point, so you need a dedicated integration for each reference lab that you work with. This can be quite a high number for some hospitals, and so often what we find is that in those instances, hospitals are only implementing interfaces to labs for those laboratories where they're doing sufficiently high volume to justify that investment. So unfortunately for those patients whose labs are being done outside of the larger reference labs that they might be working with, they may be adversely impacted as a result. As it relates to health information exchange, it's really only as flexible as the membership of that health information exchange. So if offices you routinely exchange information with aren't part of the HIE, or they haven't implemented an interoperable EHR, then you'll continue to get information in an unstructured format or in a format that's not interoperable with the system that you have. So if you think back to the chart that I showed earlier in my presentation, less than 10% of hospitals are using only electronic means, and then furthermore, much of that electronic information still remains in an unstructured format. By eliminating data entry, you can certainly focus more on data quality. There's a third option that I'd like to talk about, and that is an option to automate technology, and Becky talked a little bit about that in her presentation. Automating can really dramatically cut the time to capture discrete data and to put that data into the EMR system. It can cut it by 50% or more. It can be performed because it can be done faster. It can be performed earlier in the workflow, so on the front end of the workflow. So when that information comes in, if you have your workflow set up so that you can capture that data as it comes in, you can then send it to the physician in a structured format from the get-go, as opposed to after they've already seen that information. So one technology that has emerged that mostly automates this process, and this sort of gets to the point that Becky made earlier, that humans still have to remain involved in this process and have to assist this technology. It's called intelligent clinical data extraction. Intelligent clinical data extraction is software that uses data analysis techniques that are similar to how you and I, or humans, might interpret information to automatically identify, classify, and capture or extract discrete clinical data from those unstructured texts, and then map it to the appropriate EHR data fields and possibly also into the internal hospital codes that you might be using. And I say it mostly automates it because in the context of healthcare, data integrity is vital, and therefore, human validation is not just advisable, but really it's required. You want to make sure that that information that's going into the EMR is 100% accurate, or as close to 100% accurate as you can get it. But unlike other data entry technologies, which are really designed to assist humans using, say, a desktop software application to capture that data or to enter that data, really this is technology that automates that data capture, data entry process and extracts that data, but that is assisted by humans to perform the data checking and error correction. So it effectively eliminates the need to do data manual entry entirely, but continue to do manual data validation before that data gets committed to the EMR. So I'll talk a little bit about how intelligent clinical data extraction works. At the heart of intelligent clinical data extraction software is an algorithm that's trained to analyze document sets by systematically applying techniques that are, as I described, somewhat similar to what you and I would do when we're looking at a document. Unlike other technologies like, say, forms processing technology or intelligent document recognition or even natural language processing, intelligent clinical data extraction isn't solely reliant on a single technique like the location of data within a page, or solely reliant on the presence of a specific keyword within the document, or solely reliant on an algorithm that attempts to use linguistic rules to understand that document and to identify what the right data to capture is. Intelligent clinical data extraction uses a combination of techniques, just like you and I do, to look for clues that help to interpret those documents and to understand where the information is that you're looking for and that you want to capture in your EMR, where it's contained within those documents, and then extracting that information and mapping it to the appropriate data fields in the EMR. And I've included some examples on this slide of some of the types of things that it can do, some of the more common types of things that it can do. Use literal matches to find, for example, if you're looking for glucose, you'll find that, do a search of that unstructured data, you'll find all the instances of glucose in that document. In the case where where the word might be misspelled, so for example, word L gets transposed as the letter I, which can happen in the OCR process. So if you're talking about scanned documents, which have to be OCR'd first, sometimes it will confuse certain letters for other letters, and as a result, misspell that word, which can throw off a search algorithm. So it can do things such as fuzzy matches to find words that may be spelled incorrectly. It can also use data location. So like I said, forms processing technology often uses zones in documents to look for that data. But it doesn't rely solely on that. It can use that, but it can also use additional techniques, such as relative positions of data within a document. So you might have certain types of data where one bit of data always precedes another bit of data. And so we build those rules into the algorithm to fine-tune it around your specific document set. So we talked about some of the costs of unstructured data, but before I finish it up, I'd like to briefly talk about what are some of the benefits of not only extracting actionable clinical data from these documents and integrating the information with the patient's electronic record in the EMR, but also what are the benefits of using a technology like intelligent data extraction as the method for extracting that data. So, having structured data in the EMR certainly makes that information more readily accessible to the clinicians who need access to that information to care for patients. And also, by putting good data into the EMR in the appropriate places in the EMR and alleviating the need to sort through long lists of document attachments, it really encourages EMR user adoption. And I know that's probably something that's frustrated anyone who's been involved with the system implementation project, that simply building it is not enough to get them to use it. And it's an ongoing battle to get people to continue to use the system and use it appropriately. It also improves the sharing and analysis of that information. So having it in that structured form, particularly if it's in an EMR that stores information in an interoperable method that can be exchanged via, say, HL7, makes it much easier for you to report or share that information with other care providers. And lastly, it can also make clinicians much happier by making that information more available. The reasons why automating it as opposed to doing it manually is that it can be done at a much lower cost. Automating it using intelligent data extraction can handle the volume of many interfaces for about the cost of really one or maybe two interfaces, depending on the complexity of the document, different types of documents that you're dealing with. It's also accurate because it's assisted by humans. You get the benefit of a human double checking the data extraction before it gets submitted into EMR. And lastly, it can be done much more faster than, say, manual data entry. And so with that, I think it looks like we still have a little under 10 minutes for some questions. So I guess I'll turn it over to the moderator to see if there are any questions that have been posted during the presentation.
Great. Thanks again, Becky and Greg, for an excellent presentation. We do indeed have a few questions, and we have a few minutes to take questions if you in the audience would like to send some in. Just a reminder, please click on the red Q&A budget at the bottom of your player console to submit a question, and we will try to get to as many as possible. First one from the audience, I believe this would probably be more for Becky. Are providers at UW and nationally, from what you're hearing and seeing, disappointed with the general ability of EMRs to capture the right data?
It may depend on who you're talking to. So for UW, there's a very high percentage of data that does flow into our EMR as structured data, simply because we have large laboratories and we have multiple HL7 interfaces with laboratories. So for a lot of our physician areas, it's really not an issue. It becomes more of an issue in pocket areas such as transplant, such as some of our specialty areas in which we have patients traveling distances to see our specialists and then are returning home to have procedures performed. So for UW, not necessarily, but it does depend on the pocket area that you're talking about.
Great, thank you. Next question from the audience. Does unstructured data include scanned paper with handwritten notes, for example, referral letter from a family physician, or does it have to be more typed letter only?
So I think that question is for me. That's a great question. While certainly we can, intelligent clinical extraction technology can extract machine-printed information, it is not able to extract the bits of data that might be hand-written or printed, hand-printed information on those documents. That bit of data would still have to be captured manually, be captured during the verification process, during the verification workflow, where someone might be utilizing a verification interface to review those documents, and when they see that data, and if there's important data missing that hadn't been captured but it's contained in those handprinted notes, that information could then be manually entered as part of that verification process.
Great, thanks, Greg. Another question, this might be for the vendor side. People have said that as much as 80% of data is unstructured. What is it about the technology that prevents the eroding of some of the value of the clinical data when it's being transitioned?
I'm not sure I fully understand that question. You know, in terms of 80% of data being unstructured, you know, that to me, I've seen that statistic, so that certainly is you know, familiar to me. In terms of eroding the value of that information, if it's in an unstructured form, is certainly eroded because you know, it's just less useful when it's in that form. It makes it harder to analyze that information. So, for example, if you want to be able to analyze a large set of data, it certainly makes it much more difficult, if not impossible, to do so. You might have to normalize that data before you can perform analysis on it. But it also makes it less useful to clinicians who often are really stressed for time and don't necessarily have the time to search through all the documents to look for all the information that may be important to them for example, for making a diagnosis for a patient. So certainly that information would be much more valuable if it were captured in a structured format that could be much more easily accessed and analyzed and reported.
Great. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. What is the primary method of delivery for the unstructured documents at UW and for other healthcare customers at Extract Systems? So first Becky at UW and then Greg for other customers of Extract.
So for our transplant department, the primary method delivery is over fax. But the data itself doesn't necessarily print out on a fax machine. Rather, it stores to the server in which the application lives. So multiple systems or organizations across the U.S. may fax something to transplant, but then it's able to be processed utilizing the vendor application in order to parse out the data more discreetly. Internally, for our CDS department, right now, it's currently sent via ID mail or interdepartmental mail. So oftentimes at those sites, the physician has already looked at the results and now are asking that the results be put into the system in a discrete format. What they're starting to do, though, is automate that process as well. In fact, they're even automating it a step further, and they've created a priority and a routine, 2 different fax lines. So again, the site will fax a document in, and then the document itself routes directly to the server where the application lives. And doesn't actually print out on a fax machine. It's all an entirely automated process.
So I do think, thanks Becky for that answer, I do think that's all the time we have for questions today. We've run about an hour long. I want to once again thank Becky Schroeder and Greg Geese for an excellent presentation from both of you. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Extract Systems, for making today's program possible. Finally, we thank you and our audience for participating today, and we hope you'll join us for another Healthcare Informatics webinar. And with that, this concludes today's presentation.